Huh, sorry, people. You scared me. Yeah, that's because this is a scary game, right? It's a horror fantasy game, so it's scary. So, uh, yeah, you spooked me there. So, how'd you do that anyway? Because scaring people is hard, especially in a game. So, that's what this video is about. Horror in Shadow of the Demon Lord. So, this is Shadow of the Demon Lord talk number, I don't even know what number we're on, 98, I think. And this is going to be my discussion about how to play the game with horror in or out of it. So this is a tough one, and I ran my game last night, and I realized that I was running it, and I wasn't doing a very good job of conveying horror. And then I look back on my last several games and realize that I haven't been doing a very good job of conveying horror, mainly because I forget to incorporate the horrific and the frightening traits of the monsters that my characters are fighting, or my players are fighting. My players' characters are fighting. And so, it's kind of hard to, to convey horror if you're not incorporating those mechanics, which is really not true. The mechanics are mechanics. They're part of the game. They help to convey the fact that these creatures have an effect, a mechanical effect on your players' characters, but they don't really convey horror. Horror is an emotion that's elicited from a number of factors, not the least of which is the players, not the characters, the players feeling vulnerable and feeling as though they are in many ways helpless. Characters need to be victims in order to be considered a horror story. And it's kind of hard to victimize 7th level characters. And that's where my characters are at, 7th level. Now, when you're in the first tier of the game, starting and novice tiers, conveying horror is probably much easier because your characters are more vulnerable in those tiers. And those tiers are kind of built around the fact that the characters are vulnerable and easily replaced. And, such is the way with most RPGs, first or low level characters are squishy. And so it's easy to invoke horror and fear when your characters are vulnerable. Now, by the time they get to mid and upper levels, it's kind of hard to do that. It's very hard to do that because they have a lot of health, they have a lot of defenses, they have a lot of offenses. And so it's very difficult to scare somebody when they have so many ways of protecting themselves and hurting the creature that is trying to scare them and evoke a sense of fear and horror. So it's very difficult in this type of game to do that once you get past those lower levels, which is why I kind of have shifted my thought on, is this really a horror game or is it more of a dark fantasy game? And I think it's probably, for me anyway, more of a dark fantasy game because there are horrific elements to the game and they are sprinkled liberally throughout the course of a campaign. But like I said, the ability for me as a GM to evoke a sense of horror at 7th level is really difficult. Now, it can be done if you're a better GM than me. But for the average person like me, it gets harder and harder as they get higher level. Now, having said that, the core rule book for Shadow of the Demon Lord does talk about horror, and I wanted to kind of touch on this a little bit. So, first of all, it talks about it's a game of horror fantasy, so your adventures should include horrific moments. Don't confuse horrific with merely gross. Horror should shock and create discomfort and dismay in the players as well as the characters. Now, this is something I do a lot. I do gross my characters out. I also try to throw in moments of discomfort. Not sure about the shock. I probably have to work on that. And I'm not really sure about dismay either. Again, dismay means the players feel like they're helpless, and that's difficult to accomplish. Although I think I touched on that last night in my game, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But first of all, shock. So shocks. It says here, shock. Horror works best when it takes everyone by surprise. The key to surprising your players is to defy their expectations. Hiding horrific elements behind mundane or even virtuous facades makes them all the more troubling when they are discovered. So it gives an example here of a movie, In the Mouth of Madness by John Carpenter, which I actually haven't seen. I kind of want to now. It's got Sam Neill in it. I like Sam Neill. And it talks about a scene where he's talking to a little old lady that seems nice, but then the camera pans to behind her, and you see that she has a naked old man handcuffed to her ankle. So what makes this horrific is the juxtaposition. Really, is that word necessary? Does that word really belong in the English language? Because, damn, that is a fucking hard word to say. Juxtaposition of the kindly woman and brutal act of dominance over her husband, made worse by the question such acts raises. Why is he handcuffed? What does she intend to do with him? Is he a willing participant? And then it goes on to give you some examples of how you can shock your players, using a trusted ally that secretly bathes in the blood of fairy to remain young and beautiful. The town priest's wife is a ghoul, and he keeps her locked up in the cellar. The victims of a brutal killer prowling the city streets at night are all infested with demonic parasites. And then after pulling up the floorboards in an old orphanage, the characters discover several hundred withered human fingers still wearing wedding rings. So these are all things that you can kind of throw in. But I think the key is to use these very sparingly, because if every scene the characters encounter something like this, then it becomes mundane and it loses the impact. Then we have terror. Terror is the hardest emotion to create in the game, and it is. Rules to simulate the terror characters experience exist for just this reason. Insanity and madness result from encountering terrifying things, and the frightening affliction makes it harder for characters to act normally in the face of fearsome events. But these mechanics don't instill terror in the players. If you want to add real terror to your game, you have to shake up the players. One way is the classic formula of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. People fear what they can't explain. When a character wakes up in bed covered in blood with no explanation, that player will naturally want to know what happened and likely won't be comfortable until he or she finds the answer. Players also become anxious when things happen in the game that are beyond their control. Demonic possession, a sinister curse that gradually erodes one's sanity, the mysterious deaths of people the characters meet, glimpses of things at the periphery of vision, or weird sounds that no one else can hear. All these things can contribute to the player's unease and nudge them, him or her, closer to terror. Here's some other examples. One is one of the characters sees a child's handprint on an abandoned cottage frosty window. A character discovers a black spot on his skin one day. Each morning the spot moves to a different part of his body. The group reaches a frontier town with a large temple in the center. None of the inhabitants speak, though. If they investigate, the characters discover everyone in the community had their tongues cut from their mouths. And then finally, a character notices a large black dog that watches her wherever she goes, eyes blazing with unholy light. And then you have revulsion. I think revulsion is the easiest thing. You can always throw in gross stuff, feces, vomiting, any bodily function. Body horror, innards on display, insects crawling out of orifices, all those things can evoke disgust. And that's probably the easiest thing to throw into your Shadow the Demon Lord game. But as I said, I think terror is the hardest thing to evoke. And again, it talks about several things that are mechanical in nature to have the characters impacted by the terror that they're experiencing. But the player, to the player, it's just an inconvenience. They have a bane to attack things because they're horrified. Well, that's just inconvenience. It's thrown on top of the other banes that I throw at them for a variety of different game effects. So it just becomes another inconvenience for them that they have to look for ways to overcome with boons. So that's not really the best way to evoke terror. And doing things like he describes here, such as seeing glimpses of things at the periphery of vision. This is like Lovecraft stuff. Weird sounds that no one else can hear. That's always a good one. You send a direct message to one of your players saying that the character hears somebody talking to them, but when they turn, nobody's there, and then the character asks, who's talking, and nobody else in the party knows what they're talking about. These things can make them paranoid and make them feel like something's fucking with them, and that helps to unnerve them. But again, this is stuff you have to use sparingly, because if you do this in every encounter, then it kind of loses its impact. So to make your Shadow of the Demon Lord game a horror game, you really have to work hard at it. You have to kind of plan ahead. And you have to find the right moment where the atmosphere is right and the time is right for you to introduce some sort of horrific element to try to scare one or more of the players. So the problem with with doing this, though, is that if you're doing a one shot, it's easy. If you're playing a campaign, it gets to be more difficult, because you have a weekly session. Every week you're going 3 or 4 hours playing a role-playing game, and it's hard to come back to that well of horror and expect that it's going to have the same impact on your players. So you really kind of have to shake it up a lot. In fact, what I've been doing is I've been running my games kind of basically as a fantasy game, and then I will throw in a horrific element just to remind them that this is Shadow of the Demon Lord. And so I will continue. I'll always throw in the revulsion. That's easy. It's easy to throw in somebody covered in feces. That stuff is easy. But the scary, horrific elements, those are something that I try to hold off on and do it at the right moment. Now, am I great at this? No, I'm not. But I do have my moments. So last night in my Shadow of the Demon Lord game, I had my characters starting off in the center of Balgrendia, in the Old Dark Forest, and the Midnight Lands, as they are referred to. And none of them are woodsy type people. Well, there's one that is well versed in nature because he's a witch, but none of them are like survivalists. So they are kind of very much out of their element, and they're in the middle of a dark forest. So immediately I'm thinking, okay, this is Balgrendia. This is the land of Grimm's fairy tales, scary fae. You got a dark wood, so you got the potential for evil druids, and you've got the potential for the forest itself being a nemesis, a la Blair Witch. And so, you got all of these tools that you can use, but how do you use all these to invoke these fears and these elements? And I didn't know, because this is the first time I've tried to do this. But they had just come off of a series of adventures in the city of Lidge. So they go from a metropolis into the exact opposite, which is a forest, a dark forest. So I wanted to take this opportunity to use the environment to evoke the horror elements, more so than I was able to in the city of Lidge, because it's kind of hard to scare people when you're in the middle of a big city. So I got them in the middle of this forest, and I throw a few things at them, a couple of spirits, but again, they're 7th level, so it's really difficult to hurt them physically. So what I tried to do then is to use some creatures that don't necessarily attack them physically. So there's one creature called a Bolga, which is a spirit that has a dream attack. So while the characters are sleeping, it invades their dreams and it starts fucking with them in their dreams. So I did that. Affected 2 of the characters. That freaked them out a little bit. And then they woke up, and then the Bolga materialized, and it became a normal fight at that point. So that was one thing that I did to mess with them. Then had them walking through the forest, and they encountered some forest crones, and this just was pretty much just a normal attack. Normal monster, really wasn't scary to them, even though they're supposed to be horrific. And I forgot to apply the horrific or the horrifying trait, so that didn't help. So then we get to a couple other scenes, and I really wanted to, at this point, get them feeling like they're getting lost. And so I had them enter this area that had a path. They started following the path, and it led them right back to that same area that they started in. So they went down another path, and it led them back to the same area that they started in. And so this evoked a feeling of frustration, a feeling of, well, what the fuck do we do now? Can't get out of here. And that started making them feel helpless, because there was nothing really that they could do in order to escape the situation. In fact, the witch got in on his broomstick and flew up out of the forest above the canopy of trees. And he said, oh, now, okay, so can I see where we're going now? And I said, yes, initially, except once you continue watching, the boundaries of the forest start expanding outward and outward. And where once you saw an ocean in the far distance, it is now just endless forest in that direction. And this direction where you saw mountains on the horizon, the mountains are now covered by this vast forest that goes off into the horizon. All directions that you're looking, you now just see nothing but forest, and it all looks the same. And so, I was fucking with that character, even though he had a, innovative way of circumventing the situation on the ground. The forest was fucking with him. And so, even by flying above it, it was still able to, to screw with him. So they really had to think out of the box in order to get out of the situation. One way that they tried to get out of it was by trying to provoke Nox, the Fey Queen of this forest. And so they started, trying to put iron spikes into trees and stuff like that. This is a ginormous forest. A couple of iron spikes in a tree is not going to draw her attention. So I pretty much told them, that's not doing anything. You just wasted an hour, throwing your little iron tantrum. And so one of the other players decided that he's going to try a different tactic, and he decided to go into a meditative state and try to contact Nox, because one of the other players had actually inadvertently contacted Nox earlier when he tried to do a perception check using his arcana. And he sensed the fairy and the magical nature of the forest doing so. He basically touched the essence of Nox. But he's more of a warrior than an arcanist, so he wasn't really able to hold on to that, and Nox basically said, get the fuck out of my forest. But then they started acting poorly, and she decided to trap them. So then the player that is meditating was able to contact her, and she basically told them that they've been acting poorly in her forest. They've been defiling her her home, and that they need to make amends by providing a sacrifice at her shrine. And if they can do that, then she will show them the way out of the forest. Otherwise, they will live here forever. And so the Clockwork character wakes up from his meditation and tells the party, and then a way opens up in the forest that leads him out of this little glade that they were stuck in. So that little scene I thought went pretty well. I don't know if it evoked horror, but it definitely evoked a sense of helplessness and frustration, and got them thinking out of the box of what's on my character sheet, and more so, how can we get out of this situation that doesn't have a clear path forward. So that was a neat little scene. And then I threw a couple of more scenes with monsters in them. But at any rate, all of that just to say that it's really, really hard to make this a horror game, which is why I prefer to think of it as a dark fantasy with horrific elements that you can throw in as needed. A true horror game, I think, is something more like Call of Cthulhu, where your characters never get powerful. They may get more skillful, but they're always one gunshot away from death. So they always have to actively avoid confrontation and use their skills to get out of those situations rather than marching straight into them, as fantasy games tend to do. So with Shadow of the Demon Lord, I would look at it first and foremost as a fantasy role-playing game with horrific elements that you can sprinkle in where appropriate. And so, call it what you want. I call it a dark fantasy because, it is dark. Grimdark for some, but, however you want to call it. Is it a horror game? I don't really think so. It can be if you're really, really good at evoking those feelings. But like I said, I'm not. I don't know if the average GM is, but I'm definitely not. I'm more of a fantasy DM, and I'm getting better at throwing in the horror stuff. All right, so the last thing here talks about hauntings and apparitions and how you can use those. Haunted houses are really good because, again, that's an environment where weird shit's happening around the characters, and they can't directly affect the things that are happening. Apparitions can spook them as well, but again, you have to be really good at using that stuff. So, watching movies helps. John Carpenter movies are great. Movies like Alien and Aliens are really good, especially Aliens, because Aliens is an example of a horror action adventure. And it's not so much horror because, again, the characters are Marines with modern weaponry. So they're not helpless by any means. They are a formidable force. But the horror comes into play when they go into an unknown environment and suddenly the things that they have control of start slipping away. When they go into the alien nest, the walls have changed. They're no longer in a compound. They're now suddenly in this kind of weird H.R. Geiger alien cave, and then they run across one of the colonists, taped up to the wall, and the thing pops out of her chest. These are horror elements now because these Marines are like, "What the fuck is this?" And even though we as the audience know what's coming, the Marines didn't. So it was truly horrific for the Marines to experience this. And then things start coming out of the darkness. Even though they have dark vision with their helmets, it becomes staticky and unreliable, and these things are attacking from above. And add that to the fact that they can't use the primary weaponry because of the proximity to the reactor. So they're stripped of their primary offensive capacity. And so all of these elements are kind of crunched together in this one scene to evoke a sense of horror. And then they have to extract themselves from the scene, or TPK, right? So that's when Wrigley, brings the transport in and rescues them all. And then from that point forward, it becomes a little bit more of an action film as they try to get off the planet, and every once in a while you've got the aliens showing up, making it more difficult for them. So that is a good example of how an action adventure movie threw in some elements of horror, but it's still predominantly an action adventure movie. Whereas Alien itself was more of a horror movie. The characters did arm themselves with some modern weaponry, but they were, wrenches and makeshift flamethrowers. And the real enemy there was this alien in this ginormous ship that could be hiding anywhere, and was great at hiding in the darkness. And it kept changing its shape. They really didn't know, they were expecting this little teeny tiny alien, but the rate of its growth is something that they weren't expecting. So that was a horror element that was introduced by the story, that really put the characters in their place, even though they had a flamethrower and things to defend themselves. So anyway, look to movies, look to books, to help you invoke those horrific elements, but don't beat yourself up if you're not good at doing horror. Horror is hard. And don't let that stop you playing Shadow of the Demon Lord, because Shadow of the Demon Lord, again, is a fantasy game. So if you just run it straight as a fantasy game and you just have the mechanics of horror and frightening, that's fine. It makes it more difficult for the characters to defeat certain monsters. That's fine. No problem. It's still a good gaming experience. But definitely practice at the horror elements, because I do think that pretty much changes the tenor of the game, and it's great when the players can feel vulnerable, even when they are 7th or 8th level, and they have so many tools at their disposal, to suddenly find that these tools are useless to them because of this scenario that you've suddenly thrust them into. All right, so anyway, that's it. Wanted to talk about horror, and horror I have talked about. So we are done with this video. I want to thank you as always for watching, and I will catch you on the next video. Hail to the Demon Lord, and I'm out. If I can figure out how to turn this damn thing off. Here we go.